She was a warrior no man could tame. He was a quiet rancher with a haunted past. Together, they faced betrayal, bloodshed, and a battle that would define their future. This isn't just a love story. It's a fight for peace, trust, and survival. What they built wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in the Wild West, that's everything. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. They say third time's the charm. For me, it was just another town, another cold stare, another man too polite to say what he really meant. I arrived in Broken Bluff under a gray sky, boots caked in road dust, and fingers wrapped around the crumpled clipping from the Kansas Star. Mail order bride needed, it read. A man of means. Land. Steady work. Widowed, seeking a companion to share his quiet life. I had no illusions. I wasn't seeking romance. I wanted safety, silence, a place to vanish. I was tired of sleeping with a knife beneath my blanket, tired of every footstep behind me sounding like thunder. When I stepped off the coach, the wind hit like a slap. Bitter and dry. The kind that carried dust and secrets. I adjusted the strap on my trunk and scanned the street. 2 children ran by chasing a tin hoop. A woman in a bonnet peered from behind a lace curtain. And there he stood, Miles Cartwright, my would-be husband, squinting at me like he was searching for the woman from the advertisement and couldn't quite find her in my skin. He stepped forward, tipped his hat. "Miss Maddox?" "That's me," I said, setting my trunk down with a thud. He hesitated, took in the rifle slung over my shoulder, the heavy boots, the scar under my jaw that I stopped bothering to hide 2 towns ago. "You're taller than I expected." "I've heard that before," I said. To his credit, Miles tried. He offered me a room at the boarding house, said he needed a day or 2 to get things in order. I didn't argue. I'd seen it coming from the moment he recoiled at my handshake. My palms were rougher than his. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flowered wallpaper and listening to the hollow silence of a house not meant for people like me. The next morning, a note was slipped under the door. I didn't need to read it. I knew the rhythm of rejection like I knew the weight of a bandage soaked through. Still, I unfolded it. "This won't work. You deserve someone more suited to your experiences." 3 lines, 3 rejections, 3 towns. I packed in silence. Mrs. Hennigan, the boarding housekeeper, lingered in the doorway, eyes soft with a pity I didn't want. "You're brave, Clara," she said. "But out here, men don't want brave. They want soft." I latched the trunk shut. Then maybe they shouldn't send for women they haven't earned. She didn't answer, just pulled her shawl tighter and stepped aside as I walked out. I rode the next wagon west. It was smaller than the others, creaky. Driven by a boy who barely looked old enough to shave. The towns blurred past like ghosts. Red dust, tired fences, weather-beaten signs promising gold or salvation or rain. The wind cracked at my cheeks until they burned. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in years. Not after Vicksburg, not after Royce Harland left me for dead in a ditch outside of Missouri. I came west to disappear, not to be someone's wife. That had been a convenience, a disguise, a way to get lost in plain sight. But I was done pretending, done tucking my shoulders in, softening my voice, avoiding eye contact so I wouldn't seem intimidating. I wasn't made for tea parties and embroidery. I was made for cold nights and hard choices. We stopped near dusk in a place called Fox Hollow, a scatter of buildings nestled at the edge of a vast snow-tipped ridge. The kind of place you don't find unless you mean to. I stepped down from the wagon stiffly, every muscle aching from the ride. My back popped as I stretched. That's when I saw him. He wasn't what I expected. Most men watched me like I was a stray dog, something wild they weren't sure how to approach. But not this one. He stood at the edge of the hitching post, arms crossed, a quiet steadiness in his posture. Worn boots, gray flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the kind of scars you only get holding a scalpel too long, or a blade. "Clara Maddox?" he asked, voice low and level. "That's right," I said. "I'm Silas Boone. Crenshaw wrote me about you." I studied him. His eyes were pale blue, not cold, just clear. He was older than me, mid-40s maybe, but he wore it well. The kind of man who didn't speak unless he meant it. I liked that. "You expecting someone different?" I asked. "No," he said simply. "You look exactly like someone who made it out of hell and walked the rest of the way here." I almost smiled. Almost. He picked up my trunk like it was nothing. I got a ranch about 2 miles south. If you want to come, there's food, a roof, and no promises I can't keep." "Not looking for rescue," I said. "Good, I'm not offering one." He walked to the wagon. I followed. We didn't talk much on the way to his land. Just the crunch of wagon wheels and the hush of pine trees closing in around us. But I felt something in that silence, something I hadn't felt in years. No judgment, no fear, just quiet understanding. Silas Boone didn't ask me to smile, didn't ask where I'd been or what I'd done. He offered me space, a place to breathe, and maybe something more. Not love, not yet, but a chance to stop running, and for someone like me, that was a hell of a start. The first thing I noticed about Silas Boone's ranch was the silence. Not the fearful kind that clings to a battlefield after the last bullet's been fired. No, this silence was different. It felt earned. Like the land itself had made peace with its past and was waiting for us to do the same. The cabin came into view as we cleared the last stand of pine. It was simple, sturdy, logs stacked with precision, a porch shaded by a sagging tin roof. Smoke curled from the chimney, faint but steady. To the left, a crooked barn leaned like it had seen better decades. Fence posts lined the fields, mended with care but no flair. No paint, no flourishes, just function. Silas jumped down first, then helped me from the wagon. I didn't need the help, but I let him offer it. His grip was strong but not possessive, a grounding weight in a world that had offered me far too many hands with strings attached. He carried my trunk inside without a word. The interior of the cabin was just like its owner, sparse, clean, and efficient. A small kitchen tucked in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, a single shelf with exactly 6 books. The bed in the adjoining room was neatly made, the sheets gray, the pillow square in the center. "You'll have the bedroom," he said, setting the trunk down beside it. "I sleep on the porch in good weather, on the floor if it's bad." I blinked. "You don't have to do that. I know." And that was it. No protest. No explanation. He turned and walked back into the kitchen, started pouring water into a kettle like this was just another Tuesday, like he hadn't just offered up the one bit of comfort a man like him likely had left. I sat down at the table, watching the way he moved, measured, quiet, like every action came from years of knowing exactly how long things take when someone's life is in your hands. He set a cup of coffee in front of me, the enamel chipped, the handle worn smooth. "I don't make small talk," he said, sitting across from me. "Good," I replied. "I don't do it well." He nodded as if that settled something between us. "I've got fences to mend," he said after a long pause. "Barn roof leaks, cellar doors busted." "What do you expect from me?" He looked up and there was no hesitation in his voice. "You eat at my table. You help where you can. You don't wait for someone else to handle trouble. And if someone shows up here looking for blood, we handle it as one." It wasn't romantic, it wasn't flowery, but it was real. I met his gaze. Deal. We didn't shake on it. We just sat there for another long while, sipping coffee, letting the silence say what words hadn't yet found. The next morning, we married. It was over in less than 5 minutes. No guests, no lace, no rings beyond a plain iron band Silas pulled from a drawer and slid onto my finger without a word. The pastor's voice echoed slightly off the cabin walls, solemn but impersonal. I said, "I do," and Silas nodded. That was that. We spent our wedding day fixing the barn door. Silas hammered while I held the boards in place. He didn't offer direction unless I asked. He worked beside me like I belonged there, like I wasn't a burden to be managed or a prize to be pampered. That night, I cooked a pot of stew from what I could find in the root cellar. Dried beans, old carrots, some salted pork that had seen better days. Silas said nothing as we ate, but he scraped the bowl clean. The rhythm of life settled into something that felt almost natural. I woke before dawn, scrubbed the floors, patched a hole in the curtains with an old tarp I found behind the barn. I mended a boot sole, reorganized the tool rack, counted the jars in the cellar. Work kept me steady. It always had. Silas never hovered. He came and went with the sun, tending to the horses, chopping wood, checking fence lines. At dusk, he'd sit on the porch with a tin mug of that bitter cowboy coffee, staring out at the hills like he was waiting for something or someone to come walking through the trees. I watched him from the doorway sometimes. He never asked me to sit beside him. Never looked over his shoulder to see if I would. So one night, I did. Sat down beside him without a word. He nodded, didn't smile, just handed me a second mug and turned his eyes back to the horizon. "You were a soldier," he said eventually. "It wasn't a question." "I was a medic," I said. "Vicksburg, Missouri, places they don't bother putting on maps anymore." He nodded. "I figured. I saw your hands, the way you move, not scared of blood." "No," I said, "but I used to be." He took a sip. "I was a surgeon, civilian. War caught up to me anyway. They ran out of doctors with uniforms, gave me one with a blade and told me to stop counting." That explained a lot. The way he wrapped rope like it was fragile, the way he cleaned his tools like they still held life in them. "What happened after?" I asked. "I stopped fixing people who didn't want to be saved." We let that sit between us, the kind of truth too heavy to pick apart. I didn't offer my story. He didn't ask. But the way he looked at me, steady, unflinching, felt like permission to stop hiding. That night, for the first time since I'd arrived in Fox Hollow, I slept without my dagger in my hand. I didn't dream. I just rested. And when I woke, the morning sun bleeding gold across the floorboards, I realized something that should have scared me. I wasn't planning to leave. The days bled into each other like ink in river water. Quiet, cold, oddly comforting. Life with Silas Boone wasn't sweet or gentle, but it was steady. The man moved like a whisper, like someone who had spent a long time trying not to wake ghosts. And I worked like I had something to prove. Maybe I did. I kept the cabin running like a field station. I knew how to do more than sew wounds shut and reset bones. I knew how to ration food, make vinegar from wild apples, even rig a pulley for hauling water from the well. Every small task became an anchor, each chore a reason not to think about the past I still carried like shrapnel lodged too deep to remove. Silas gave me space. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer compliments either. But he noticed. The hinges I oiled stopped creaking. The patch on his coat held better than the one he'd sewn himself. The stew I made with wild onions and old beans earned a quiet nod at dinner. For a man like him, that was praise enough to fill a book. Some evenings I'd catch him watching me. Not with hunger, not with pity, just a kind of quiet recognition. Like he saw the lines carved in my face and understood each one had a name. One night, we sat on the porch, just breathing the same dusk air, a chill crawling across the land as the sun sank behind the hills. "I know that look," Silas said, breaking the silence. "What look?" I asked, staring out at the tree line, arms folded tight. "The one that says you're waiting for something to catch up to you." I didn't answer right away, just stared ahead, let the silence settle again like ash. "War doesn't end just because someone calls it over," I said finally. "There are pieces of it still under my skin." He nodded, slow and deliberate. "Same here." And then, maybe because the stars were beginning to show, maybe because the night felt thick enough to hide what needed hiding, I spoke. "I was assigned to a medical division," I began. "We followed a unit that wasn't officially supposed to exist. Ghost Division, they called it. Led by a man named Royce Harland. Said he fought for the Union, but we didn't get orders, only coordinates. The places we went were too poor to matter, too far to make headlines. We didn't help those towns. We emptied them." Silas didn't move, didn't blink, just listened. I kept records, quietly. It's what you do when you know justice won't come from above. The second time I tried to leave, Harland caught me, shot me in the shoulder, left me for dead by a frozen creek. A freedman found me, got me to a clinic run by churchwomen. I healed, changed my name, disappeared. "Until now," Silas said, voice low. "Until now." We sat in silence again, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with understanding. He didn't ask why I hadn't told him sooner. He didn't ask what I'd written in those records. He just leaned back in his chair and said, "If someone comes for you, they'll have to come through me." And I believed him. After that night, something shifted between us. It wasn't romance, not the kind you read about in books, not the moon-eyed softness strangers like to imagine. It was quieter than that, more dangerous. We knew how to stand back to back. We knew how to watch each other's blind spots. Trust, that was the word for it. The rarest currency in war and marriage alike. In the mornings we began training without calling it that. Silas would ask me to check the fence line with him, and we'd track prints together. Elk, raccoon, the occasional coyote. He'd ask me to clean a rifle and watch the way I loaded the chamber, nodded once when I did it right. One afternoon, I found him laying out traps in the barn, repurposed bear snares with fresh oil and newly forged teeth. He didn't say why. I didn't ask. But we both knew something was coming. You don't smell old blood on the wind unless it's riding something real. That week, I cleaned my Winchester twice. Silas sharpened his axe in silence. We fixed the broken boards on the porch, reinforced the shutters, laid extra firewood beside the back door, and then came the knock. 3 sharp raps, not urgent, not friendly, measured like someone already knew they wouldn't need to knock again. Silas opened the door. I stood behind him, rifle against my leg. A man in a long coat stood there, one eye gone, a badge tucked into his belt, and a calm that made my skin crawl. "Mr. Boone," he said. "Miss Maddox." I didn't move. "My name's Greeley, Pinkerton. I'm not here to arrest anyone, though some men back east might wish I was. See, the woman you married, she was declared dead outside St. Louis 3 winters back." My heart didn't skip, it stopped. "She's not dead," Silas said calmly. "I can see that," Greeley replied, "which makes a few powerful men nervous, one in particular." "Royce Harland," I said. He gave a small nod. "Word is he's been looking, and he doesn't like to leave questions unanswered." Silas stepped forward, not aggressive, just steady. "This is my wife, and anyone who wants her better bring more than words." Greeley glanced between us, nodded once. "Then I suppose I've done my job." He turned and walked away, didn't look back, just vanished into the dusk like a bad thought you can't quite shake. After he was gone, Silas stood there for a long time, staring into the dark. I waited, but he didn't speak. Instead, he walked into the barn and stayed there until well after midnight. I didn't follow. I knew what it was to carry something so old and heavy, you needed to sit with it in the dark. That night, I laid a fire and waited. When he finally came back, he peeled off his gloves, sat across from me, and said, "We don't run." I met his eyes. "No," I said, "we don't." And just like that, the quiet life we'd built was no longer just about survival. It was about standing our ground. It started with a map. The day after Greeley left, Silas unrolled a yellowed sheet of parchment on the kitchen table. His hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, measured, deliberate, firm, as he drew lines, circled ridges, marked out the blind spots in the valley. "We've got natural cover here," he said, tapping the curve of a slope near the tree line. "If they come by foot, this is where they'll funnel in." I leaned in, fingers stained with ash from the morning fire. "And if they come by horse?" He didn't look up. "Then they'll ride bold and loud, and we won't have the luxury of waiting." It wasn't a plan born of panic. We didn't shout. We didn't rush. There was no frantic digging of trenches or strapping rifles to our backs like desperate fools. What we did was methodical. Like medicine, like war. Silas walked the property twice a day. I rewired the snare traps we'd used for coyotes, reinforced the barn doors with heavy iron latches, and started boiling down pine resin for makeshift pitch bombs. We didn't have dynamite, but we had barrels, we had fire, and we had time. Just enough to turn that house into a fortress. 3 days later, a wagon rolled up the hill. It wasn't Harland. It was Walter Gibbs, our nearest neighbor, a man who lived 3 valleys over and only came by when something was dead or dying. He climbed down with a groan, handed Silas a crate, and wiped his nose with the back of a leather glove. "Heard Royce Harland was sniffing around these parts again," he said. "Figured you'd need this more than I would." Silas popped the lid open. Inside were 6 sticks of dynamite, each one wrapped in old newspaper and tied with wax string. I raised a brow. "You believe in making a statement," Walter grinned. "A loud one." That night, Silas and I set the charges ourselves. One near the creek crossing, buried beneath a rock that looked like nothing. Another under the old root cellar door no one used. The last 2 we tucked into the base of the haystack, our decoy. If Harlan's men were stupid enough to hide there, they'd disappear before sunrise. We didn't talk much while we worked. We didn't need to. Each movement was a promise. "I have your back. I won't flinch." The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror and took a pair of shears to my hair. I hadn't cut it in years, not since Missouri. Not since I'd tried to blend in, tried to soften the edges. I wasn't hiding anymore. I tied the braid with black thread and laid it in a cedar box on the mantel. "No more running," I said aloud. Silas stood behind me in the doorway. He didn't say a word, just nodded once and handed me a fresh tin of bullets. The days grew heavier after that. heavier with waiting. We stopped pretending to be anything but what we were, two battle-worn souls preparing for the next war. We slept with boots beside the bed, rifles within reach, ears tuned to the creak of floorboards and the wind's direction. Every little sound had a meaning now. A snapped twig could be a deer, or worse. A missing hen was no longer a nuisance. It was a warning. Then, one morning, Silas came in with dirt on his knees and tension in his jaw. "South fence line's busted," he said. "Fresh prints, 3 men. One of 'em's limping." I didn't ask how he knew. I just went to the closet and pulled out my Winchester. That night, we didn't eat dinner. We sat on the porch in the cold with our backs to the wall, rifles across our laps, the sky above full of bruised clouds that hadn't yet decided if they'd snow or break apart. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was loaded, a stillness before the storm, a shared breath held in anticipation of the next move. When the first branch cracked, I didn't even flinch. Silas tilted his head slightly. One was coming around the barn, another by the haystack, a third creeping along the edge of the porch, steps too soft for a drunk, too clumsy for a soldier. Hired hands, sloppy killers. I moved like wind, slipping through the back door and circling wide behind the house. My rifle was steady, my breath slow. I caught the one behind the barn first. One shot. He dropped like a sack of oats. From the front, I heard Silas's rifle bark, sharp, measured. He never missed. By the time I crept up on the third man, he'd just raised his hand to the door. He never got to knock. I pulled the trigger. He crumpled at my feet, blood steaming in the dirt. Then came the fourth. He wasn't part of the trio. He came riding in alone, confident, like he owned the place already. Royce Harland. I saw him before Silas did, tall, lean, wrapped in a black Confederate coat like some half-dead ghost refusing to be forgotten. His gloves were silver, his rifle slung across his lap like a throne. He dismounted with theatrical grace, boots crunching the frost-bitten earth. "Clara Maddox," he drawled, voice like poison stirred into sugar. "You never did learn when to stay buried." I stepped out from behind the fence, rifle low but ready. "And you never learned when to quit chasing shadows." He glanced toward the porch where Silas now stood, rifle ready but not raised. "This your new man?" Royce asked. "You always had a taste for broken soldiers." Silas didn't blink. "I'm not the one hiding behind dead men," Royce laughed. "This isn't over. The railroad wants this land. You made too much noise. You and your war bride." That was the last thing he said before I fired. The bullet clipped his shoulder, sent him spinning. He hit the ground hard but didn't drop his rifle. Rolled. Fired. Silas went down with a grunt, shot in the leg. I didn't think. I ran. There was no second shot, no cover. Just years of fury pushing me forward. I tackled Royce before he could line up another aim. We hit the snow, fists and boots, and blood flying. He drew a knife. I bit his wrist until he dropped it. We rolled. He cursed. I choked him. "You'll never be free," he gasped, eyes wild. "They'll always come." I pressed harder. "Then I'll keep sending them back in pieces." His breath stuttered once, then stopped. I rolled off, chest heaving, hair plastered to my forehead with sweat and snowmelt. Silas limped to me, pale but upright. "You good?" he asked. I looked at him, hands trembling. "No." But I didn't cry. We stood there as the sun rose over a blood-soaked clearing. We burned the bodies that afternoon, not out of hate, but as a message. Justice wasn't given here, it was claimed. The smoke lingered in the valley for 2 days. Even after the bodies were ash and the fire had long since died, you could still smell it. Gunpowder, pine, and something darker beneath. It clung to our clothes, to the cabin walls, to the wind that swept across the porch in the early morning. Death has a way of leaving traces, no matter how deep you bury it. Silas didn't speak much the day after. His leg was bandaged tight, and he moved with the stiff, stubborn grace of a man who refused to let pain slow him. He spent hours out by the barn, hammering the fence posts back into place, fixing the gate the gunfire had splintered. I think he needed the rhythm of it, the noise, something to drown out the echoes of that night. Me? I went back to my routines. I boiled water, cleaned the rifles, patched up the tear in Silas's coat, and stitched the sleeve I'd ripped in the fight. But none of it felt the same. Everything had changed. Not just the ranch, us. We had stood back to back and walked out alive. That mattered. I didn't sleep the following night. I sat by the window sharpening my knife. Not because I needed to, but because it reminded me I was still here. still breathing, still ready. When dawn broke pale and thin across the land, I found Silas in the kitchen, leaning on the table with a sheet of parchment in his hand. "They posted the new land registry," he said, tapping the page. "Word got out. Railroads backed off, for now." I nodded. "And if they come again? Then we do what we did before." I poured 2 cups of coffee, handed him one. He sat across from me, eyes drawn but clearer than they'd been in weeks. "They're calling us heroes," he said, almost like a joke. "Can you believe that?" I smirked. "No." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out another folded page. "They offered to buy the land, triple what it was worth before." I stopped sharpening. My gaze met his. "I said no," he added. The silence stretched between us like warm sunlight on a cold floor. Then he leaned back, exhaled slow. "I'm tired of giving up things just because someone else wants them more." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The next few days passed with a quiet steadiness. Spring was late coming to the valley that year, but you could feel the shift, like something buried deep beneath the frost had decided it was time to stretch and wake up. Birdsong returned, tentative at first. Just a few curious notes at dawn. The river behind the ridge thawed slowly, ice cracking like bones beneath the surface. New green shoots pushed through the dirt beside the porch stairs, delicate but determined. Inside, we moved around each other differently now. Not like strangers, not like soldiers, like something else entirely. We didn't touch much, not yet, but the distance between us felt deliberate, not empty. Like both of us were giving each other room to grow into whatever this was becoming. One afternoon, I sat out back, watching the chickens peck at the earth, when Silas joined me with a bundle of wood under his arm. "I've been thinking about building a forge," I said. He blinked. "Going back to smithing?" "Maybe, maybe not. I want something of mine. Something I shape. Something that doesn't need defending with a rifle." He nodded, slow and thoughtful. "I'll build you the roof." That was all he said, but it was enough. We spent the next few days clearing out the shed near the east fence line. It had been used for hay storage once, long before either of us got there. The roof sagged and the floorboards were soft, but it had good bones. We worked side by side, hauling out rotted beams, reinforcing the supports, laying new planks. We didn't rush. We didn't talk much either. But the air between us was warmer, lighter. That evening, we stood together under a sky turned gold by the dipping sun. The light caught on Silas's face, highlighting the scars he used to hide. They gleamed like metals. My own hands, rough and scarred, rested against the rail of the porch. Strong hands, survivor's hands. "You don't flinch anymore," I said quietly. He looked at me, and his smile was small but steady. "I don't have to." I didn't smile back, not yet, but I felt something shift in my chest. Something fragile and dangerous and good. That night, I lit the fire early. We didn't sit in silence. We didn't reminisce. We just were. Two people who had seen too much and somehow, still, wanted more. When I woke the next morning, the world was changed again. Snow, not heavy, not yet, but enough to blanket the valley in a hush. Enough to remind us that the world would keep spinning, even after blood had been spilled and names had been buried. I stepped outside, breath turning to mist, and watched the flakes fall soft and slow across the field. Silas came out beside me, a blanket draped over his shoulders, coffee in hand. "Still think you want that forge?" he asked. I nodded. "Now more than ever." He grinned. "Then I'll start digging out the foundation after breakfast." I looked out across the land, our land, the fences we'd rebuilt, the graves we'd dug, the traps we'd set, the valley we had defended. I had never meant to stay, never meant to belong. But somehow, somewhere between the quiet mornings and the bullets, I'd found something I never thought I'd want again. Not peace, the fight for it. And that, I decided, was worth holding on to. It was just past midnight when the knock came. 3 sharp raps against the door, firm, deliberate, not rushed. The kind of knock that doesn't ask permission. The kind that says, "We're not here to talk." Silas and I had been playing cards at the kitchen table, neither of us really watching the hands. Just passing time the way people do when they know it's about to run out. When the knock hit, we froze, just for a beat, and then moved like the soldiers we once were. Silas stood and moved to the window, keeping low. I snuffed the lamp with 2 fingers. Only the glow from the fireplace remained, flickering orange against the walls like memory. He tilted the curtain back a fraction and nodded once. "Not Harland," he whispered. But close enough. I had my rifle in hand before he even finished the sentence. I moved to the door slowly, heart pounding but steady. When Silas gave the signal, I opened it. A man stood outside in a uniform that hadn't seen battle. Clean boots, tailored coat, silver buttons polished bright. His gloves were the same silver as Royce Harlan's, ornamental, unnecessary. His smile was patient. "Mr. Boone," he said, "Miss Maddox." Neither of us answered. "My employer would like a word," he continued. "He's nearby." "You tell Harland," I said, my voice steady. "If he wants a word, he can come find me himself." The man gave a polite nod, like I'd just declined a dinner invitation. "He plans to," he said. "He just thought he'd offer a chance to make this less bloody." Silas took a step forward, his voice like a door slamming shut. "Tell him we're ready." The messenger dipped his head once, turned, and walked back into the snow. His footprints were gone before the wind finished passing. We didn't sleep that night. We sat near the fire, rifles cleaned, blades sharpened. It was the kind of silence that felt like breathing before a dive, the kind of silence that didn't ask for comfort, only readiness. At some point, Silas asked, "You ever think about what you'd be if none of this had happened?" I didn't answer right away. My eyes stayed on the fire. The logs popped softly, like bones settling. "A schoolteacher," I said at last. "I had a voice like a bell once. Used to read poetry to my little sister under the apple tree in spring." Silas stared into the flames. I'd have raised horses, never picked up a gun, probably would have married someone soft, someone who baked too much and cried at sad stories. I finally looked at him. "Still time for some of that." He smiled, just barely. "I don't think I'd change it." That surprised me. "Why?" His eyes didn't move from the fire. "Because all of it, every terrible, blood-soaked, soul-splitting moment, led me here, to you." I didn't know what to say. I wasn't good with soft things, but my throat tightened anyway. Before I could speak, a gust of wind rattled the shutters. Dawn wasn't far off. We stood and moved to our positions without needing to say a word. Silas limped to the reinforced barn wall, rifle slung across his shoulder. I climbed into the loft above the root cellar and peered through the narrow slit between the boards. The snow was thick now. Not a storm, but a steady, suffocating fall, the kind that hides footprints and dulls gunshots. And then, hoofbeats. 5 riders emerged from the trees, silent, practiced. Not hired thugs this time, soldiers, ex-military. The way they moved gave them away. They fanned out, slow and methodical, taking up positions. One behind the stack of barrels, one near the well, one by the porch. The last 2 stayed back, rifles in hand, scanning the windows. I held my breath. When the first one stepped into range, I squeezed the trigger. The crack split the stillness like lightning. He dropped without a sound. The others scattered, returned fire blindly. Silas's rifle barked next. A clean, tight shot that took the second man in the chest. The rest dove for cover, their return fire wild and splintering wood. I slid down from the loft and slipped out the back, boots silent on snow. I circled wide, flanking them. I caught a glimpse of the third man crouched behind a trough. One shot, he was gone. Another by the smokehouse. Gone. Only one left. And then came the sound we'd both been waiting for. Royce Harland, in all his arrogant gallop, rode into the clearing like a man arriving late to a play he already knew the ending to. He was dressed the same, black coat, polished rifle, the insignia on his chest still catching the light like a lie told too many times. He dismounted smoothly, eyes sweeping the property. I stepped out from the shadows, rifle lowered but not forgotten. "Clara," he said, spreading his arms. "I always admired how hard you were to kill." I said nothing. He looked at Silas, now standing just behind me, favoring his bad leg. "This him? The one you let guard your back?" "He's the one who never tried to own me," I said. "That's more than you can say." Royce gave a slow nod. "I'll be honest, this isn't personal anymore. The railroad wants this valley, you and your little war story, your noise, and I clean up noise." He lifted his rifle. I fired first. The bullet struck his shoulder, spinning him off balance. He dropped his rifle, fell, rolled, came up swinging. I charged, not from strategy, from rage. We collided in the snow. He slammed me down. I elbowed his throat. He drew a knife. I twisted, grabbed his wrist, bit down until he screamed. The knife hit the ground. We rolled, fists flying, knees slamming into ribs. I got on top and wrapped my hands around his throat. "You think this ends with me?" he hissed. "They'll always send more." I didn't blink. Then I'll keep sending them back in pieces. He choked once, twice, then went still. Silas limped to my side, breathing hard. You good? He asked. I looked at him, blood on my face, hands trembling. No, but I stood. Together. We burned the bodies at dusk, not for justice, not for revenge, for warning. The valley deserved silence, and by God, we would give it that. We didn't talk much in the days that followed. There was no need to. The valley had gone quiet again, not with fear, but with a kind of sacred hush that only comes after something violent is put to rest. The snow lingered longer than usual that year, melting in slow patches that left behind muddy scars across the earth. Our boots sank into the thawing ground with each step, but neither of us complained. We were alive. We were still standing, and sometimes that's enough. The birds came back first, timid little things that chirped at sunrise and startled at every creak of the porch. Then the grass, green shoots pushing stubbornly through the frostbitten soil. Even the river found its voice again, cracking through the ice, babbling like it had forgotten what silence felt like. Inside the cabin, the air was different, lighter. Not soft, never that, but easier to breathe. Silas still limped, though the wound had started to close clean. He'd given up the cane 2 days after Royce Harlan was put in the ground, said it made him feel old. I didn't argue. I knew what it meant for a man like him to keep walking on a bad leg. It wasn't about pain, it was about pride. We found new rhythm in the aftermath. The chores came back into focus. The barn got repaired properly this time, with new beams and fresh nails, not just quick fixes. The chickens returned to laying. Even the old milk goat seemed less mean. But under the calm, we both knew it wasn't over. Not truly. Some things you bury deep. Not because you're done with them, but because you're choosing not to bleed anymore. One afternoon, I stood at the window with my knife in hand, sharpening it out of habit. The sound of the wet stone against steel was rhythmic, comforting in a way that reminded me of the field tents, the triage stations, the war. Silas entered quietly, a folded sheet of parchment in one hand. They posted the new land registry, he said, voice calm. I didn't look up. And we're clear. The railroad pulled out. The story spread too far. Too many folks heard about what happened here. I paused, ran my thumb along the edge of the blade, checking for imperfections. They called us heroes? He scoffed softly. Seems so. That made me set the knife down. Heroes. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I'd seen what real heroes looked like. Most of them didn't come home. And if they did, they didn't feel much like celebrating. What else? I asked. They offered to buy the land again, he said, pulling out a second parchment. Triple the price. My eyes met his. And? I said no. There was no discussion, no back and forth, just that one sentence. And in it, everything we were building. Outside, the wind shifted. The valley seemed to breathe. You're not scared anymore, I said. Not a question. Silas leaned against the table, arms crossed. Of being alone? I was, but not anymore. That admission, simple, honest, hung in the air like a bell note, long and low. I let it settle. Then I nodded. Later that day, I walked the length of the ridge behind the house. The snow had thinned there, and the sun was hitting just right. I stood at the edge for a while, looking out across the valley. The fence lines, the trees, the graves. No markers, no flowers, just stones and wind and the memory of what we'd done. I didn't mourn them. I didn't regret it. Some things are carved in blood. And some things are carved in choice. That night, I made stew again. Thicker this time, richer. I even added a bit of salt pork Walter had traded us for helping him patch his barn. Silas said nothing, but he went back for seconds. After dinner, we sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, the fire pit crackling in front of us. The stars came out slow, blinking one by one. It felt like the world was waking up from something dark. I ever tell you about the time I stitched up a captain's throat in the back of a mule cart while under fire? I asked suddenly. Silas raised an eyebrow. Can't say you have. I launched into the story, wild hand gestures and all. For the first time in months, I laughed. Real belly-deep laughter that made my ribs hurt. Silas laughed too, low and slow, like a man who hadn't done it in too long. When the laughter faded, we sat in the quiet, the good kind. You ever think, he said, that if those men hadn't turned you away, you'd be living a very different life right now? I thought about that, about the 3 towns before Fox Hollow, about the trunks packed and repacked, the letters left unanswered, the bruises, the blood, the silence. I'd still be fighting, I said. But I wouldn't be free. Silas nodded, didn't press further, just sat beside me, hands warmed by the fire. The night wrapped around us, not like a threat this time, but like a promise. And for the first time since Missouri, I stopped listening for footsteps in the dark. I listened for silence, and I welcomed it. Spring didn't arrive in a rush. It crept in, slow, stubborn, like someone testing the floorboards of a house they weren't sure would hold. The snow melted in streaks, first along the base of the porch, then the edges of the pasture. By mid-April, the valley was streaked with mud and green, like the land itself had been scrubbed clean and left to dry. Silas built the forge like he said he would. He started with the roof, working by lantern light after chores were done. I watched from the porch some evenings, a mug of tea growing cold in my hands. He didn't do it for thanks, didn't make a show of it, just saw the work and did it, piece by piece. I laid the foundation with stones from the riverbed, each one chosen by weight and shape. There was something comforting in the building of it, stacking things that would stay, choosing what would stand. After years of running, of surviving, of barely holding together, this was different. This was mine. The forge was small, but it was solid. A coal-burning hearth, a thick oak workbench, a wall rack for tools we didn't own yet. I carved my initials into the threshold before we swept out the dust. CM. Not for Clara Maddox, not exactly. For something else. Something still becoming. Silas walked up behind me as I was setting the final stone into place. "You think it'll hold?" he asked. I turned and looked him in the eye. "It's already holding." We stood there a while, just breathing in the smell of smoke and fresh timber, watching the last light of day sink behind the ridge. That night, we shared a meal at the table without weapons in reach, without boots on, without fear. We didn't talk about the past anymore, not because it didn't matter, but because it had finally stopped defining us. Instead, we talked about the things we wanted to plant this year, about whether the fence needed extending, whether we could convince Walter to trade some beehives for spring honey. The quiet between us had changed. It wasn't cautious anymore. It was comfortable, like the silence between verses of a song you've known so long you hum it without thinking. The following morning, I found Silas in the barn, staring at a broken saddle. He ran his fingers along the cracked leather like it was a scar he hadn't noticed before. "You thinking about riding?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't look up. "I was thinking, we could go to town." I raised an eyebrow. "You, among people?" He smirked. "We could trade for some seed, and if someone asks about what happened here, they'll already know," I finished for him, because word had gotten around. It always did in places like this. They didn't print our names in the papers, but the story lived, about the ranchers in Fox Hollow who'd stood their ground when others might have run, about the woman who didn't wait to be rescued, about the man who stayed. We hitched the wagon and rode into town that Saturday. The road felt different, less threatening, more like a path we'd chosen instead of one we'd stumbled onto. When we pulled into the general store, heads turned, some nodded, one man tipped his hat. No one asked questions. Inside, I picked out seeds, tomatoes, beans, carrots. Silas traded for lumber and a new kettle. We moved through the space like people who belonged, because we did. On the way out, an older woman stopped me. She looked at me like she knew my story, even if she didn't know the words. "You look like someone who's done enough fighting," she said softly. I gave her a polite smile. "I've just learned to fight for different things." That night, after the seeds were planted and the new kettle hung over the fire, Silas and I sat on the porch as the sky turned lavender. The moon rose fat and gold, casting long shadows across the field. He reached over and took my hand, not urgently, not out of need, just certainty. "You ever think," he said, "about what comes next?" I looked at him, at the man who once said he wasn't looking for someone to rescue, at the man who had stood in front of me when the past came knocking, at the man who never tried to tame me, only to walk beside me. "I think," I said, "I'd fight to keep this." His fingers tightened just slightly around mine. Later, as stars blinked to life and the valley fell into its familiar hush, I thought about all the versions of myself I had left behind. The girl with too much fire in her chest, the medic who carried too many names in her memory, the woman 3 towns rejected for being too much of something they couldn't name. And then I thought about this version, The one sitting beside a man who never once asked her to be less. The one with a forge, a home, and a future she'd earned with her own blood and grit. I was always meant to fight, I whispered. Silas looked over at me, eyes soft with something unspoken. But for the first time, I added, I'm fighting to stay. He leaned over, kissed me, not with urgency, not even with heat, with reverence, with steadiness. When it was over, I looked at the land stretched out before us, the fences we'd mended, the scars we'd stopped hiding, and I smiled. Because peace, I realized, isn't the absence of danger. It's choosing to build something anyway. Thank you, truly, for staying with us all the way to the end of Clara and Silas's story. Your presence here means more than you know. This wasn't just a tale of survival. It was a story about choosing to live, even after life has tried to break you. It reminds us that healing doesn't always come with time. It comes with courage. The courage to stand your ground, to love again, to build something that lasts even when the world says you can't. Clara didn't wait to be rescued, and Silas didn't try to change her. Together, they showed us that peace isn't something you find. It's something you fight to protect. Now we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment and say hello. We're building a global family here, one powerful story at a time. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We have many more tales just like this, gritty, real, and full of heart, coming your way. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never stop fighting for the life you deserve.